Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Some people welcome the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, yet criticize the same procedure when applied to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What does Hugo Slim, director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice and senior research fellow at Oxford University, who studies ethics, war, and humanitarian aid in international relations, think about this? We discuss both Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the war in Gaza. The interview was conducted as part of the Umbrella Development Forum organized in Bratislava by the Platform for Development Organizations, Umbrella. So do the ICC warrants for Putin and Netanyahu still matter? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also the description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Professor Slim, the International Criminal Court, ICC, has issued an arrest warrant for the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. However, the Russian lawyer was in Mongolia last year, a country that recognized the jurisdiction of the ICC, but Ulaanbaatar didn't arrest him. Putin also visited Alaska, where he met with US President Donald Trump, and, by the way, you may not know, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico visited him in Moscow twice. Does an arrest warrant for Putin still matter?
I think it still matters, yes. I think the important thing about courts is that they try people and find the truth about whether the law was broken or not. So I think it's very important to have legal process, including for heads of states. But I also recognize that when it comes to heads of state, political realities are often more powerful than legal realities. So, of course, some countries will welcome President Putin into their countries without arresting him, and for reasons of peace negotiations or for reasons of alliance. So the courts are important, and indictments should be followed through with judicial process to see what happened. But of course, politics trumps law in many situations.
So apart from the scenario of the fall of Putin's regime, which would most likely have to be related to some military defeat for Russia, can you imagine Putin ending up in The Hague?
I think it's hard to imagine it at the moment, but I think even so, there could be important legal progress made by pursuing that case in absentia or just gathering the documentation about the deportation and forced transfer of children, and that is an important part of international law that we need to scrutinize and to make sure does not happen. So any legal process which clarifies what happened to children at the hands of Russian officials, Ukrainian children, is going to be important, whether Putin is there or not.
I think you just visited Ukraine. What is your work there?
So I'm actually working with Ukrainian Red Cross, and I'm working with them specifically to train the next generation of humanitarian diplomats. So we're going back for the second, what they call Youth Diplomacy Forum, where they gather international relations, international law students from across Ukraine's universities, bring them to Kyiv, and then the Red Cross gives them 2 days of instruction on diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy. And this is the second time we're doing it. So we're trying to ensure that, Ukraine in the future has the young diplomats it needs to make its humanitarian case internationally.
Mm-hmm. What does it mean, if you can define it? What does it mean in humanitarian diplomacy?
So it means working hard as Ukrainian foreign diplomats or as Ukrainian NGOs and humanitarians to raise the right issues about how people are suffering across Ukraine, whether they're displaced people or prisoners of war or whatever, and how you can raise those issues diplomatically and get international attention, international support, international finance to help.
If we look at the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, many people would say, and I think I tend to agree that this is a very black and white war. That basically there's an aggressor and there is a victim. Ukraine is trying to defend itself, and basically the war, of course, started in 2014. We can say that. Some conflicts are a little bit more blurry, you can say. So how you see that? Is this like this with Ukraine? Very clear distinction between aggressor and between victim to victim, and aggressor is doing bad things and victim is just trying to defend itself.
Yes, that's basically how I see it. I don't believe the Russian view that somehow, Europe has stolen a core part of the Russian identity and heartland by, luring and pulling Ukraine towards the EU and NATO. I think one of the problems that Russia faces is that a lot of former Soviet Russian allies don't want to live under Putin's protection and Putin's influence. They would prefer to live in a European Union or NATO sphere. And therefore, it's not a question that Europe's pulled a core part of the Russian world towards Europe. Actually, the Ukrainians and many others have chosen to walk that way. So I don't believe Putin's narrative, and I certainly think he is, without doubt, the aggressor in this case, and a really violent one, and not just an aggressor on the Ukrainian people. I think he's a huge aggressor on the Russian army, who have suffered so many victims of this war as well. And he seems to care very little for the lives of his own citizens.
So if you, on one side, has somebody like Putin, who, as you said, he doesn't care or cares very little about the lives of their citizens, and of course, it clearly doesn't care about the lives of Ukrainians or the others. You saw what Russia did in Syria and in other parts of the world. And you mentioned humanitarian diplomacy. How does it work on both sides? I mean, in Ukraine, what can, for example, Red Cross do in Ukraine at this moment? And are there any efforts to do something on the Russian side?
So the Ukrainian Red Cross is doing incredible things. It's an organization that was really very small at the beginning of the invasion of Crimea in 2014. It's gradually grown and professionalized. And then with the full-scale invasion in 2022, since then it's really become huge and in a way a world-leading Red Cross organization. I mean, the Ukrainian Red Cross is now teaching the European Red Crosses about civil defense, about humanitarianism in war. It's really a leading humanitarian organization. Internationally, of course, the humanitarian diplomacy can try to work with the Russians to get, access to Ukrainian prisoners of war held by Russia and to ensure better treatment of those prisoners. It can help facilitate prisoner exchanges if necessary. So there's a lot it can do. It's harder to see how the International Red Cross can change Russian military behavior and change Russia's occupation behavior in its treatment of people under Russian occupation in Ukraine. But it has to try, and the Russian Red Cross is still there and should be able to play a role in looking after Russian citizens affected by the crisis.
No matter what kind of agreement at the end we will see, probably part of Ukraine will be still occupied. Of course, Ukrainians would like to see their country and being recognized in their international borders. But let's say that the part of Ukraine will be occupied. We talk a lot about sending troops, peacekeeping force, whatever here. But I don't hear that much about what should we ask from Russia, of course, in the potential peace agreement. How should they behave as an occupied power on the Ukrainian territories? And I'm mentioning this because I think from my perspective, it's quite important because we know that at this moment, clearly Russians are violating human rights, torturing people at the occupied territories. Do you think that it should be an effort how to find at least some kind of framework, how if Russia will occupy at least part of the Ukraine, that there will be some kind of control over it by, by the UN, by Red Cross, or by any international organization?
So I would agree with you. I think Russia is violating large parts of international law in its occupation of Ukraine, not just by occupying it, but actually by trying to Russianize it, to change the population pattern there, to create new Russian settlements there, to Russianize it in terms of demography, culture, language, everything. That is a violation of international laws of occupation. And of course, it's a violation of all sorts of people's human rights to self-determination and the right to speak in their own language and the right to free association, all sorts of things. So I think you're right. I think it would be very important if there was a really dedicated international effort to monitor Russian occupation in Ukraine. And, if we're criticizing Israeli occupation and settlement of the West Bank and effective annexation, we must criticize Russian annexation, occupation, Russianization of Ukraine as much and much more, really, because it's so many more people.
As a humanitarian, how do you assess such ad hoc efforts? What we can see, for example, from the First Lady Melania Trump trying to open the channel of communication with Putin and talk about the fate of Ukrainian children. It is probably somehow useful, but again, I'm looking at this as more like an ad hoc effort, not something that is probably sustainable. But from your perspective, how do you see that?
I like diplomacy. I like any kind of diplomacy. I mean, I think it's important to keep talking. And I think when diplomats say they're not talking to that person because they're an enemy, that's usually an error. I think you need to talk in what they call back channels all the time. You need to keep relationships open. And in these situations, the most surprising relationships can actually be the ones that bear fruit in the end. If we look at Northern Ireland, it was extraordinary business people coming together who just knew each other, and one or two really brave politicians who were not very famous but were prepared to cross the line, and religious people, priests from both sides. So I think, if there's a women's initiative at high level, that shouldn't instantly be ridiculed. I think we should think that might work. Generally, the ones that work, you don't hear about. So if you're hearing about them, like Melania Trump's one, it's probably not the one that's going to work. But in the Trump age, you never know.
Yeah, I have to say I didn't try to ridicule it at all. I'm just looking at this in a sense, okay, this is one of the efforts. And as you mentioned, we might see something behind the scene. And of course, there is still, and I think it's clearly working, there is still a constant communication, maybe via third parties, between Kiev and Moscow, for example, about the fate of the prisoner.
That's been productive.
And that's been productive.
Russia has a long tradition of having some of the best diplomats in the world and having one of the best diplomatic services in the world. And I think they should be, treated professionally in that way, and people should be talking to them, whether behind the scenes or openly. It's important to keep talking. That's what diplomacy is for.
On the other hand, when I see Mr. Lavrov basically trolling everybody with the USSR shirt, I don't think that's that professional.
Yeah, absolutely. But, there's no doubt which side Lavrov's on. So,
So how would you feel if the Russian war against Ukraine ended in such a way that the parties involved agreed, among other things, on immunity for everyone, including Putin?
So it's interesting. I mean, we're possibly going into a new phase of political realism in the world where things like amnesties will come back. And always in wars, there's tended to be, even after the Second World War, a level of amnesties at some level, but not at others. So it may well be part of the bargain in some way. And it depends who can live with it. If Ukrainians can live with it, if others can live with it, and if the upside of amnesty is good enough, then people can live with things after war. As we know from Europe generally, you don't get total justice at all, ever. You never get reparations after war in any real sense. Losses are losses forever, but we can make peace and keep moving.
I think it's important what you said. I think that if Ukrainians are fine with that, I just think that we shouldn't try to impose our views on them.
I agree. I think, this whole fight is about self-determination and and therefore they should be able to determine what is fair in a peace process.
How do you assess the ICC arrest warrant in the case of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? There are people who welcome the arrest warrant for Putin but criticize the arrest warrant for Netanyahu. So how do you see this?
I think, if you invest in the International Criminal Court and you recognize them, then you have to follow their indictments. And I think it doesn't mean Netanyahu is guilty. It needs that there's a case for a trial. And I feel the same about the South African case in the International Court of Justice about genocide. I do not think the Israelis have been planning and committing a genocide in Gaza. But I think it's important that if enough people think that there is a case there, that the case is heard. Because we need courts to answer questions of justice that we are not clear about. I think these cases are good to have and to do.
So you said you don't agree that Israelis are trying to commit genocide in Gaza. On the other hand, you said that, if I understand it correctly, that you wouldn't be against having Prime Minister Netanyahu in The Hague. So,
well, yes, but he's been indicted for war crimes.
Yeah, of course.
So that's, that's possible. We should hear that and let's see. The law has to be worked through, and it may well be he's not guilty of of war crimes. And so, we'll hear one way or the other.
After the cessation of hostilities, what forms of accountability do you believe are, let's say, morally necessary and practically feasible in Gaza? And I'm also asking this because we often hear from politician experts that only Hamas is responsible for all the civilian casualties due to the fact that the extremist movement continue fighting. Again, how do you see this?
I do think Hamas are hugely responsible for the suffering of their civilians in Gaza. I think, everyone talks about Israeli proportionality and how they fight disproportionately, but Hamas, in the very nature of their resistance and their ideology to use violence and their strategies and tactics of war fighting, mean that they accept huge amounts of casualties and deaths and injuries in their own civilian population. They know that every time they attack Israel, they will then fight a war which involves thousands of Palestinian deaths and destruction of Palestinian property. And I think their whole approach has been misguided for the last 20 years. And I think that their approach to resistance, their militarized approach to resistance, has been a disaster for the Palestinian people and a missed opportunity for peace for 20 years.
But is the proportionality on the Israeli side real?
So I think, if you compare it to other intense urban warfare, you get huge casualties in hard-fought urban warfare. If you compare the Battle of Mosul or the battle in Aleppo or the battle in Marawi in the Philippines, when an armed force is fighting a Dugin Islamic resistance organization who use the buildings all the time, then you get a massive destruction of infrastructure. And if civilians are present, you're going to get high rates of civilian casualties as well. In Mosul, 1 million people could flee Mosul before. In Marawi in the Philippines as well, hundreds of thousands of people got out in the week before the battle really started. In Gaza, they could not get out, and everybody's responsible for that, really. And so they had to be moved around and evacuated depending on where the fighting was. That has been hell for them. But fighting in cities like that, and remember, Hamas had about 40,000 soldiers dispersed all over the area of Gaza, is going to be really costly in terms of civilian life and civilian infrastructure.
Given your work and your book, Killing Civilians, and expertise in the ethics of war, how do you assess, it seems, the consistent patterns of destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Russian war against Ukraine and the high civilian death toll in Gaza, how those things challenge or redefine traditional justice in war principles, particularly the rule of distinction?
Well, I think the Russians and the Syrians, the Assad regime, reintroduced indiscriminate aerial bombardment of cities. I think they deliberately were indiscriminate in their attacks. I mean, particularly when Assad was using barrel bombs, which are by nature indiscriminate. You push them out of the back of a plane. And I think Putin is doing the same in Ukraine, but actually he's also really trying to prioritize hitting power installations, defense manufacturing, all these things. So he's also going beyond the business of just killing civilians to try and destroy infrastructure on which civilians depend. And he's also legitimately trying to attack defense establishments and things like that.
So do you see that there are some changes, really?
I think there are changes because I think in the war on terror, it was not in NATO's interest or American interest or British interest to kill a lot of civilians because they wanted the support of the civilians. In the Russian-Ukraine war, Putin doesn't expect the support of Ukrainian civilians, so it doesn't matter if he kills them, for him, for his logic. And in Syria, it was the same. Assad and Russia wanted to destroy areas of opposition and weren't trying to win their hearts and minds.
But I can probably say that maybe also about the Palestinians, no?
So in the same way, I think Israel knows it's not going to win over the Palestinians, but it also knows it's best to limit civilian casualties there if it can. And I think considering there were 2 million people living in Gaza, if the civilian casualties are, something like, the overall figure is 70,000, so maybe it's 40,000 civilian casualties in a population of 2 million. It's a terrible thing to say, but, that is not as high as it could have been.
Probably not, but I think that many people would extremely disagree with you. And in a sense that, it's a very squeezed enclave.
Yeah.
And also, I have to say that, one thing is definitely bothering me. And yes, we can probably discuss every case forever. That, there were like 200 journalists killed there. There were no access of journalists into Gaza.
It's interesting, but I think, again, the access that humanitarians and journalists had, not international ones, but Palestinian journalists had in Gaza was quite exceptional. They did not have that in Mosul. They did not have that necessarily in Aleppo or Marawi in the Philippines. So in most really intense urban warfare, so many journalists are not on the ground and so many humanitarians are not on the ground. So it's partly this contradiction that so many aid agencies are in Gaza, so many Palestinians become journalists in a conflict like that as a sort of patriotic duty, that you have these very large numbers of journalists and humanitarians right in the middle of the fight. It always happen when warfare spaces are evacuated totally beforehand.
True, but also many of those people were killed.
They were.
And I think,
but then
some of them...
But the Geneva Conventions, they basically say you have to be incredibly careful, but they don't stop you fighting. And not every civilian death and not every journalist death and not every humanitarian worker death is necessarily a violation of law. It can be a coincidence, an accident, or a terrible consequence of a legitimate attack or a legitimate defense. And
yes, of course, but I think the scope and scale is such a huge that I think that having a case in Hague, I think that would be quite interesting.
But I'm saying that, yes, this case should be, these cases have to be looked at.
Yeah.
And it's important that they go to court so that these discussions can be had and precedent can be made.
And one last thing, we talk about the war, the ethics of war a bit, the rule of distinction. What about what might be the future of war? I mean, especially autonomous system, maybe system that will just what at this moment soldiers are doing. Where are we heading?
Ukraine has really changed the nature of warfare with extraordinary rapid drone development of swarming, so hundreds at a time, of range. I mean, there's some phenomenal range of drones now in play across Russia and Ukraine. So we're definitely seeing automatic or automated or autonomous weapons playing a much larger role. And the challenge is now how you stop them and how you develop your own autonomous and automatic weapons and enough to defend yourself. And that's the European challenge now, because Europe is behind in terms of defense against drone warfare on its own borders.
But don't you think that more autonomous weapons will simply lead to the... Because frankly speaking, I think if we have machines, we can send the machines to the war. And as a politicians, you don't send waters to the war. So it's much easier to send machines to the war than people.
Yeah.
So we might get into the situation that the wars will be more likely.
Well, I'm sort of agnostic about this because actually, if you look at human agency in the history of war, it has been disastrous. So when you give humans full control, they do things like the Holocaust in Europe, the Rwandan genocide, indiscriminate bombing, torture. So when humans are in control, it's not the ideal situation. So it's possible that actually autonomous weapons might bring some benefits to restraint in war. It's possible, and we don't know yet. I think this idea of simply saying, weapons without human control are automatically evil I'm thinking, well, weapons with human control are often automatically evil too. So it's not a simple choice.
It is not, but I think that it's easier for AI to decide that, okay, let's bomb it, because it can see it from the strategic point of view why we are not using nuclear weapons.
Possibly. But I don't know yet. We don't know enough yet.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.